Hello everyone, my name is Charles Joe and I am with Ledgerback. I'm going to be providing the voiceover for Lecture 4 Data Cooperative Examples and Resources for the Introduction to Data Cooperatives course, which is a self-paced course providing an introduction to, as you can guess, data cooperatives and other emerging forms of data stewardship or data intermediaries. Okay, and so in this lecture, I'm just going to be just describing going over the readings for Lecture 4. Hopefully, you've read the readings before watching this video, but this will be much more helpful. And I'll only be going over some key points which I thought were very important to discuss from the readings. So here's the outline. For the slides, and what's going to track with the required readings. Okay, state of data stewardship. So in this article, pretty much we're just getting a snapshot of the data stewardship ecosystem as of, I'm pretty sure, 2022. 2021, 2022. And it's just a really nice little overview of like where the data stewardship ecosystem actually is, and just how these new emerging forms are actually somewhat doing. And so, then we move on to the results. So the results themselves were not necessarily that surprising. So first, bullets, stewards in healthcare are more resilient than in other areas. This one made, a good amount of sense. Because there's generally more of a personal connection with healthcare data, and it's a lot easier to, I would say, at least find, suppliers and data users. I think it's a little bit easier in a healthcare context, especially with how much health data generally gets created, and just generally there's a lot of uses for health data. So I think that's definitely helps in that regard. But at least from the article, as we can see, majority of the stewards in healthcare pretty much were still operational. It's only one out of 24, so 4%, which was no longer operational. While coming out from the sustainability sector, a third of them were no longer operational. But I think that just gets to a key point about healthcare deficits. I do feel it's a little bit more personal, and they're just probably just more uses, and like clear uses for health data than for other types of data. All right, moving on to the next point. Blockchain can be a technical means for data ownership, but there's a lack of discussion on governance structures. This one felt, this one's pretty accurate. I would say at least with blockchain and a lot of these, called Web3 technologies coming out. One of the big claims is, blockchain can be provide a technical means for really data ownership. But of course, the main thing pointed out in the article is that even though it could be a technical means, there's not, doesn't really address any of the governance side. So you have some new technologies coming out, for example, Streamer, and mentioning articles called Data Unions DAO. So people want to create decentralized autonomous organizations, a DAO, to somewhat it's a somewhat steward data, but it's not very clear, if you're stewarding that or just creating a data marketplace. And going back to, discuss more in Lecture 5, as data marketplaces. But, a lot of them focus a lot more on data marketplaces, so that might not necessarily be changing the actual power inequities in the data economy, but it's definitely a means for people to aggregate data and monetize it. But whether that necessarily changes anything about data economy, that's really up for debate. And mentioned in the article as well, which I thought was an interesting point, was just the fact it's called data union, but doesn't necessarily have the foundational qualities of a union like you would expect from a labor union, because there's really a lack of discussion on governance, participation, and representation. So that's something to also keep in mind, is that the technical means for steering data are being developed, and it's not just blockchain. There's a lot of other technologies being developed which can help people steer their data, like personal data stores, like Solid, for example. And there's like excuse me. And there's also like a host of others, but it's not just blockchain. There's also many other technical means to give people the ability to steward their data. Even though, blockchain can provide a technical means. Of course, it gets a little weird when you talk about data ownership, since the concern is really less ownership, but more, really stewardship, and how do we actually manage this data, rather than can I necessarily monetize the data? Because just monetization by itself might not necessarily change and really address the core problems in the data economy. All right, so the next point, data trusts remain largely esoteric, limited practical responses and application. This one's pretty straightforward, because of course one of the main limitations is you have to live in a country which actually has a common law trust framework or something similar. So it's really a tough thing to put into practice. And also, it's not necessarily really being developed that far. I know, like, one example is like Place, which is trying to create a data trust for these geolocation data, but that one's I think not necessarily run into difficulties, but they didn't really be able to get it up and running. But I'm not too sure that's necessarily a more business thing rather than a trust thing. But trying to push a data trust is as difficult as mentioned in the article. And it said it's really more imperative to look at other models of stewardship, like cooperatives and collaboratives. So data cooperatives and data collaboratives, and as you can tell, this course focuses a lot more on data cooperatives. And so, those are probably better areas to look at, because not every country has a common law trust framework, and you can technically apply a cooperative or collaborative pretty much anywhere. Most countries have the legal structures to really implement both of those. All right, moving on to the next point. Most EU-based private sector initiatives generate revenue through subscription or membership models. This one's pretty interesting, and as you can see, this kind of goes back to the point about not necessarily a lot of development data trust, but more of the cooperatives and collaboratives. And so here we have poly also mentioned, and so this kind of ties in back to the data cooperatives. Data cooperatives are membership-based organizations, so this is probably the method to go with. And though I've didn't mention it here, there were also some policy updates, which could also make collective forms of data stewardship more likely to develop with the Data Governance Act in the European Union (EU) and the Consent Manager Framework in India. All right, moving on to the next point: scalability and sustainability. As the authors know, a lot of the data stewards scale through partnerships with data providers, technology firms, and local state agencies. This part here just really highlighting the need to really be able to find or at least identify potential users of your data and just how important that is. And once you can find users, that actually makes it a lot easier to scale. And especially you can partner with another organization which wants to use this data. So that was a really good point that was made in the article. And then we have a pretty good point here, which gets mentioned by the authors with Scoop, how really working with the CO3 project to help facilitate citizen participation, health research. So that's a pretty good example of a partnership, just finding someone to partner with to provide the data, and then from there to use the data. So just really highlighting the importance of someone pretty much acting as the intermediary and trying to find users for the data. All right, moving on to the next point. Develop or redevelop business models. So this is a pretty good one. Just talking about like the fact that you might have a business model, but you might need to reinvent it, find another one. That does happen. I won't really get too much into that one. So let's move on to the next point. And then the way forward, users will more likely participate when there's a personal connection. Once again, going back to healthcare data. Excuse me. Really just having that importance, because with health, that you have that clear personal connection. And I think with other types of data, you might not necessarily have that clear personal connection, or might just be harder to establish. So that's also really, really important. Really important thing to be able to show is that there is a connection between you and the data and how it should be used. And in the article, they really mentions like that it's got a personal connection or aligns with particular issues. So not necessarily that's something personal, but it has to be something that motivates you. So a couple examples he gives: contributing climate action efforts or empowering more inclusive research. So just trying to find ways you can connect suppliers, or at least give incentives for suppliers to want to share their data. All right, moving to there's a need to demonstrate use cases. The other point is very important, is that these really are just new forms of new organizations. So we really do need to have a lot of use cases, a lot of case studies to really understand the best way to develop data stewards. So we really just need more people trying it. And especially in this in the beginning, which is always the hardest, because it's extremely hard to get data suppliers to join up, and then from there develop a product or service, and then try to get people to use it. So very difficult. But unless we get more use cases, it's hard to tell the best way to do it and improve. Find ways we can help data stewards improve the way that they run their stewards. All right, moving on to the next point. There's need for social and technological infrastructure for data accessibility. So of course, this still needs to be improved, and kind of goes back to my point about the blockchain. Even though blockchain can be a technical infrastructure, it's not the only one. There are other means about giving people not necessarily data ownership, but a means for really stewarding their own data, whether that be individually or collectively. And that is just a really good point, is that we still need to keep developing the infrastructure for data accessibility, find participatory ways for people to govern data. So a lot of work still needs to be done there, but that's how it is in the beginning. There's usually a lot of work to be done. All right, next slide. All right, so now we're moving on to principles for revenue models of data stewardship. I really like this this paper. I hope you guys really enjoy it too. So first, foremost, like, what is the issue? What's the core driving argument, or what's the core driving problem of in this paper? Is, how do you develop a revenue generation structure for data storage that aligns commercial interests with the interests of individuals and communities, most notably the data suppliers? That's really the biggest thing, and it's really this the core issue that you really do have in the data economy is, how can we incentivize data sharing and at the same time empower individuals. So that's really core issue, and as it's phrased here, it's how do we really align our commercial interests, have it be commercially viable to store shared data, and also give people the means to be empowered over how it is shared and used. So we pretty much empower them to govern their data. And the core thing is really that this ties to the revenue structure, or just the business model, is that we have a robust business model, then it's much easier, or at least more likely, for data to be able to respect the interests of the individual communities who provide the data suppliers, and not to be not necessarily like hell bent on just trying to produce revenue, at the expense of the interests of the data suppliers. And so this article also introduces 3 conceptualizations of data, and that's also a very important point. So that's how you conceptualize data changes how you try to address the core issues in the data economy. And so we have 3 conceptualizations mentioned in this paper. Data as a commons, data as labor, and data as an asset. And we'll talk about that in more detail in the next slide. Okay, data as a commons, public data stewardship. So in this view, data is anti-rival good, which means that it actually becomes more valuable the more people use it. This kind of goes back to data's ability to, really only becomes really valuable in the aggregate. So that's one of the reasons why it's anti-rival. Additionally, if I use data, it doesn't diminish someone else's ability to use the data. So that's really the big point, is that data does have anti-rival properties. And additionally, in the from the commons perspective, the goal is really to distribute the benefits of the data without privatizing the goods. And at least when it comes to privatization, it's really more completely closing everyone off and only trying to generate revenue from purely cutting off access from everyone. Our goal is usually to open access, but at the same time find a revenue structure that allows you to have open access, but still, still have enough funds to manage the resource. So this is something you see that's very common with open source projects. And I know what does it mean? Shifting data governance. I probably butchered the name of the article, but in the article they also go talk about data commons and how that's probably the most popular form of data stewardship right now. And as you can see, it's very much centered on open source, open access, trying to make things accessible. Okay, and then okay, and then moving to the revenue structure. Apparently, guiding mechanisms for stakeholder participation and also to redistribute value. Generally, you see more of this data commons approach for that's more public in nature, so like urban planning, mobility. Generally, revenue gets generated from management and monetization of the resource. So it might also be coming from fees as well. And generally, where accountability comes from, this can be through legal and social mechanisms. So if there's a legal entity involved, additionally could just be social norms and common cultural practices. And so a really good example that's mentioned in the paper are the Skull and Trust ports, which is up in Scotland. And so trust ports manage the commercial interests in Scotland's coastal ports. It's a statutory mandate. So they have a stakeholder-based governance model. And so with that, the board itself, and so with the, it's still just first and stakeholder-based board governance model. So the board is elected to manage the trust. The stakeholders can be really anyone, but generally you would expect the stakeholders to be the port users. Model-wise, it's pretty similar to like a nonprofit cooperative. So if you're familiar with that model, the trust ports are actually like pretty similar. So the primary power for stakeholders is really the ability to elect the board and keep them accountable by being able to monitor performance and then suggesting removal if there's a need to remove a board member. And I thought the revenue structure here was actually like really good because it really does still keep the stewards still have that active engagement, but at the same time the steward is still able to find a lot of ways to really utilize the assets to generate revenue. And so if you can take a look at the graphic, for instance, the stakeholders they pay a fee to the trust ports, and transport uses those fees to help support to match the infrastructure of the ports, and by paying those fees, you get access to the ports. So, as you can see, there's the revenue structure itself really makes sense because for the stakeholders, there's a reason to pay the fee, and for the board, there's a reason to manage the ports. So there's a lot more alignment in this model than you might see in other models. And so I thought this was a good example of really just a public good stewardship. And that was a really good one. Okay, moving on to data as labor, the union models. So why would you pick a union? Really to make people aware of their own labor and that they should demand compensation. Once again, it's really focusing on the legacy of labor unions and how they arose in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah, and also to increase an individual's ability to bargain with debt collectors. Because consent management usually falls on the individual. That's a really important one, so that's really been mentioned in the other lectures as well. It's really just the difficulty for an individual to manage consent. And to give a proper definition of a union, which is also described in the paper, it's really just a mechanism by which a group of workers unites to make decisions about conditions affecting their work. So it's really just a means to help understand collective decision-making processes and then trying to apply this here in the data stewardship context. And so, as you can see, that's the next bullet. Really the goal, collect twice the rights of data suppliers, really get them to understand their own labor and how that can be compensated, and again, to think and decide how the data is shared and used from a collective standpoint. And the revenue structure is actually pretty much follows the same model you would use for any labor union. And so the at least the researcher here is once again a FITA entity model. So branch is collecting quarterly fees or annual fees. That's really up to the union, and then the union uses these fees to bargain with third parties, so tech companies, business societies, and the fees go to sustain committees who will do this on the behalf of the union members and redistributes the value back to supporting members. All right, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so now data as an asset, financial intermediaries. So here we start talking a little bit more about intermediaries in another context, in a more financial context. So really talk about financial advisors. So what's an advisor do? They manage assets. We have users and provide advisory services on how best to optimize the assets or a group of assets. Generally, investment advisors in the U.S. and in India usually have a fiduciary duty to users, and that's something that's been brought up in other lectures is the fiduciary duty, and trying to make sure that the intermediary has a fiduciary duty. And just for a reminder, fiduciary duty is pretty much just having a duty of care to to whoever the user is, and making sure you act in their best interest. So you can't just take the data, monetize it for yourself, and try to generate some revenue. You just have to do that if it was in the best interest of the user. So that's a really important one to keep in mind. And so regarding the revenue structures, there were two that were mentioned, really in the paper. It's commission based and fee only. So with commission based, usually this comes when you earn income from products sold. So you get a percentage from every product that gets sold. While with the fee only, the fee paid directly by the client. So really the revenue structure that made the most sense here was the fee only. And so the fee only was chosen because this will actually be able to provide that fiduciary duty, and also doesn't necessarily automatically put the interests of the user and the advisor at odds. Though of course this doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. It's just that's less likely to happen from the onset. And of course, it's a nice graphic provided as well for the fee only structure. And as mentioned in the paper again, the big thing is that this rating model kind of ties into the with the intent of the and so in the fee only structure, there are two ways that you can really design it. It's either yearly fee, which could be described in the paper as typically 1% of your assets, while it could also be an hourly or project-based fee, which could be around $1,500 USD for a full financial plan. But there is a drawback. Of course, there's usually always a drawback. As mentioned in the paper, if the advisor receives compensation from percentage cuts of assets, they're motivated to prevent you from depleting your investment portfolio. So this really advising against big purchases or removing things from your portfolio. And then going on to professionalism is important management of assets such as data. Really, the importance of this is that there should be some level of professionalism. People trying to professionally manage an asset, and most importantly, if there's all professionals involved, you can receive expert advice, and so this expert advice could be considered a value-added service. So this could help make data stewardship more sustainable, because it could give you advice on how to share your data, how and when, if the goal is to monetize, how best to monetize, if the goal is to do something for some non-monetary benefits, it could be like helping provide data to help curb climate change, or to help with a study for some healthcare research. They can help give advice on that. So that's a value-added service that could also be given to make the data steward more attractive. And so from the author's investigation, they landed on these 5 principles for developing revenue models for data stewardship. And so I'll just go over the principles. So person's responsibility. This refers to maintaining physical independence from third-party interests and allow stewards to be in service of individuals/communities. This is really kind of the core issue that this paper wanted to dive into, was how do you actually do that? And so one of the things I mentioned is looking at fee to entity structure, and also another thing came in mind is also what mechanisms can you use. So it could be legal and social mechanisms. So that could be one way to keep a responsible revenue structure. And then to the next one, legal regulation. Pretty much saying that there should be a legally recognized entity. So the entity that manages data should be its own independent entity. So that way it's not necessarily just an individual or group of individuals. It should be its own organization, which can really manage itself. And so this really to help emphasize that fiduciary responsibility and cements other principles such as accountability. Okay, moving on to the next principle, value distribution. And so the big thing, of course, here is we want data stewards to help on value distribution and making sure that it gets distributed to distributed for the benefit of communities, society, and the individual. So we want to make sure the value that gets generated gets properly distributed to the stakeholders. And so they mentioned an example with trust ports. So for trust ports, it's operated for the benefit of the community at large, and acts on the benefit of all the stakeholders in the operation. So that's kind of like an example of value distribution. It's like, so they maintain the ports, they get that value back to the port users, and they can use that to do other things. All right, moving on to accountability. Okay, and kind of like this, legal and social mechanisms for accountability to ensure stewards stays true to their purpose, and allow for decision-making systems that have a place for data suppliers. And so that's extremely important. And so if there are legal and social mechanisms, it's much easier to keep people accountable, and then also to ensure that data suppliers also have a seat at the table. Okay, move on to sustainability. Really the last principle, as that data shall strive for sustainability in the long term. And multiple considerations here how to do that. You could diversify revenue models. You could plan for future development, find new innovations to make the steward more forward-looking, and ways to enhance the way data, the infrastructure for data and how data gets used. And additionally, you can also do value-added services. A couple examples to give are additional user protection, professional advice, and guidance. So those ways that can help make data steward more sustainable. And so those are their 5 principles. I think they're actually pretty good ones to think about developing a revenue model for data steward, and hopefully this paper is pretty helpful. Well, hopefully it's helpful to you in the build a data steward exercise. That's where it would be the most helpful. All right, next slide. Empowering gig workers through data. So this is a really short video talking about driver seat co-op. So who are the stakeholders here? You have rideshare drivers, who are the data suppliers, and public transportation agencies and urban planners, who are the data users. So we pretty much do have a platform here. And so the co-op model, why Hayes was talking about this, why you pick the model. He wants to align incentives around trust, maximize value for all stakeholders, so being very extractive. Then wants that kind of model, wants something that actually disperse value instead of concentrating it. And so they picked a limited cooperative association as the legal framework. This is a legal framework that exists in Colorado. And so since this is a model in Colorado, this one they picked, and this one's a lot more flexible regarding investors. And so we get the big why, like why driver seat. So that's kind of like a really nice problem statement. A lot of rideshare drivers realized that they had little control over how the algorithms deployed on rideshare platforms scheduled work for them, and little control over working hours and conditions and how much pay they received. A lot of that ties into the actual data that goes into the platform, trying to figure out how are people getting paid, how are other people how are other drivers' working conditions. It's not something you can necessarily see just from the app itself. Something you might, this one you can really only tell if you look at the whole data and not just using the user interface for the app. And then for urban planners and transportation regulators, they lack visibility into rideshare and transportation systems, so they can't really plan for anything, but so how anyone was using ride sharing. So as you see, the problem for both sides, which of course you kind of do need for a platform. And then data rights. I thought that was a really important part of the video. As Hayes was eloquently said, you gotta understand the needs and the problems of your data suppliers and data users, and you might need to go into the field and just talk directly to them, but you really do need to understand that. And then makes a really good point, and something that gets reiterated upon multiple in the other lectures about really about data stewardship, and really kind of the goals of some of these emerging forms of data stewardship. So that the goal isn't necessarily to commodify or exchange data, but to give the ability for data suppliers, data users to collaborate, work together in defining and solving problems. So this really does help empower the data suppliers, make sure that they're actually have a seat at the table, and also connects them with data users. So there's that connection between them, and so it gives them the ability to work together. It's importantly just having given data suppliers really that seat at the table, and even going back to Pentland's paper, it's really about how do we get the insights from the data and share the insights so that people can use those insights to help improve their lives, whether it be just personal or business, but or even something else, just some improvement in life, not just solely providing some monetary reward. Okay, next slide. Episode 14, Patient-Owned Allied Healthcare Plans with Dr. Jen Horangeff. It's a really nice podcast. And so, it's really cool just hearing the idea for Data Cooperative. It's actually pretty similar to Hayes Witt's. Really figure out that there's a problem on both sides of this health data marketplace. for the patients, you had people who did want to share their data, but there wasn't necessarily a collective means for doing it. And then on the health company side, they want to get patient insights for their own, for different kinds of health data related research, but they didn't necessarily know how to contact patients and really pick their brains. So that's really where the idea came in, at least for Jen, was that I was just really in contact with some of these people working at healthcare companies, and she's like, "Well, hey, I'm a patient. I have an understanding of how to of kind of the means to give you feedback on your stuff." Yeah, and so so I was saying, Jen already knows some people working at these health companies. She's like, "Well, I'm a patient. I can help you guys, get patient feedback." So that's really where the idea comes in, and also to make sure that actual patients are involved, and really ensuring that they're going to participate in these in this research, where that be something clinical or just product feedback, that they should have some upside in that development, instead of just someone giving that feedback and data for free. And then second point, that's what Tesla versus academic knowledge, like platform cooperatives. That's also a really important point. So that's there are some academic work at platform cooperatives, but at the end of the day, you need people to actually try to develop and run these organizations. And so, as Jen mentions in the podcast, like, even though a lot of people talk about playing cards, she's like, well, I actually had to she's like, well, I had to run one, and there's academics, but like you don't really know what's going on until you actually start one and you try to build it. So I thought that was just a really important part to mention, is that even though there is some knowledge out there which can be helpful, and it's not necessarily the same or knowledge or things you would need to know if you're trying to run an actual platform cooperative or just a data cooperative in the real world. And this goes pretty much for any data steward. If you're trying to run data steward, the academic knowledge might not necessarily be one-to-one to your actual experience of trying to run a data steward. And then when it comes to bootstrapping, I thought you made a really good points here about which I think just applies to really any new organizational form, and just trying to develop these types of data stewards, and really trying to do anything really at the frontier. Also regarding bootstrapping, is that not necessarily everyone has the same privilege to do unpaid work in DAOs or platform cooperatives, nor does everyone have the same drive to make the vision a reality. Also really an important point that she mentioned is that she at least for I think the first 4 years was not making any money from Savvy, just trying to run it with their own funds and just get it up and running. And that's once again, that is part of some of the startup life, and it's extremely difficult. And so she didn't necessarily want to just have volunteers. Just like, well, the goal is to provide upside, so just having people work for free doesn't really necessarily make a lot of sense. So like, well, if it's a nonprofit, it would probably make more sense. But at least in her case, the goal is to provide not necessarily just financial upside, but of course also there's governance rights, but really just like the upside. Things go well, you should get the upside. And so I thought that's just a really important point to make, was that people are trying to develop these new organizations, these new data stewards. It's like not necessarily everyone can work on them or wait for them to develop and become somewhat sustainable or get funding. So not necessarily everyone can work on this type of work, but if you can, that's it's a good thing. But I think it's just important points to keep in mind, and to the second part, it's, not necessarily everyone has the same drive to make the vision reality. I think that's also really important too. Is that's even though we do have, I'd say a lot of people do see there are core issues in the data economy. Not necessarily everyone's going to be willing to work on trying to develop really this new forms of data stewardship. They might be interested, but they might not necessarily, have the drive to really push it to, once again, make it into reality and really put in the work to create something that actually, exists and it's actually like operational. That's a very tough thing to do, and this I feel it kind of goes back to the state of data stewardship article that you mentioned in, I think it was the first slide after the outline. Saying we need more use cases, and that's just kind of one of the reasons why is to figure out like what's the best way of developing these types of organizations. Because once you have a better idea of that, then it should be easier for more people to make them. And that goes back to that point about having that drive. It's really tough to do it. To have that drive, especially when you're a first mover, and that's something that Jen really points out. It's like, oh, I'm kind of just doing this, and like, there's really no template or roadmap to follow. I'm kind of just going on my own, and that's extremely difficult. So, just as that article mentioned, we need more use cases. We need more case studies to show us, what are the best ways to develop these types of organizations, or just new types of data stewardship, so that it would be easier for the next generation of developers or entrepreneurs to create them and hopefully have them be successful. And it's like under challenges, as I mentioned before, the lack of roadmaps, legal structure, and so at least for Jen to like realize like, oh, I want to make a cooperative, but okay, so like what the hell is this, and how do I figure out how to make one? And so for her, that was a difficult process, but not necessarily because the structure didn't exist. Like the co-ops already exist. They should have a legal structure, or at least a legal template already exists. The issue really was more of a lack of knowledge of like, oh, okay, I want to make something that's a collective, based organization or stakeholder, for organization, but like what structure do I use to actually accomplish that? So she's reading about co-ops, and it's like, well, I can't really make a co-op in New York because I don't really get it. So she called up Jason Weiner, and in Colorado, and they made it in Colorado. But that's part of the challenge as well, as figuring out what legal structure to go with, how to set it all up. That's a discussion in of itself, and that can also be a challenge. And so that's really where like the lack of roadmaps really hurts, is that you have to spend a lot of work on some of these building blocks, trying to investigate and figure out which ones to use. So that's really where the lack of roadmaps can really be very hurtful. And also, how do you fundraise without venture capital? And let's say I left a note there. And so that's a really important part that Jen mentions, that she knew a lot of VCs who were interested in Savvy, but since she wanted to keep it stakeholder based, even though they were interested, they didn't want to put any money because they want to have complete control of the organization. That's what they wanted. So that's where there was a mismatch between Jen and these venture capital firms, VC firms, and that's gets like a really short but important note, is that sometimes there's a misalignment between the entrepreneur and the venture capitalist incentives, because the VC wants to get a return, because they have to pay back their limited partners, while the entrepreneur usually just wants to create the organization or develop a product or research. And so the goals aren't necessarily always aligned, and could lead to different things happening. And one of the points they mentioned was that the entrepreneur probably doesn't want a boss, but they have a get venture capital money. It's like, well, now the venture capitalist is the boss. So it's just an interesting dynamic there. But showing that what the VCs, like, they want to get a return, while the entrepreneur usually just wants to develop the company or product and make it sustainable. So the interests aren't necessarily aligned, even though of course they work together to grow the product or resource or the company. The actual end goals can be different, so that can lead to some issues. Then contribution tracking, I thought Jen made really good points. It's like, there's a lot of talk about Web3, DAOs, kind of whatever. Uh, to Jen, but the thing she thought was really important is like, oh, is there a way we can develop more tools for contribution tracking so we can reward people for different types of contributions? And that's a really big point for the cooperative model, is trying to reward people for for contributions, or it could be labor, it could be something else, but trying to reward people beyond simply just their capital holdings. That's really kind of the main goal, is trying to recognize contributions and trying to reward people for their contributions, whether whatever that could actually be. And that's one thing that Jen really focused on, and I thought that was a really important points to mention, because there's lots of ways you can contribute to a data steward. But of course, depending on how the data steward recognizes contributions, it might not necessarily reward every type of contribution. So that's a really important part to always keep in mind, is how you track contributions. Also determines how you reward contributions. All right, and then lastly, data broker. So Savvy, reward rewards members for referrals, and one of the things I mentioned is like, how can we give recurring dividends to people for referrals, because it's not necessarily the referrals generate value just once. That person comes, they sign up for a couple of gigs, and the gigs go well, and they keep going. It's like, well, technically you're creating continuous value, so that's why they want to do a recurring dividend. And so that's just a really important part to keep in mind, especially for developing a revenue model for a data steward, is that the contribution someone gives is not necessarily just one time and it's done. It could be something that provides value to the data steward, and increasingly at least greater returns. And so once again, going back to the anti-rival nature of data, more data you get, the better it is, and generally the more contributions to it, the better it is. So it's just something to also keep in mind, is as whether you go to one-time payments or recurring payments to provide to encourage people to participate in the data steward. And so 23andMe, that's like a really good example for the opt-in versus opt-out of data sharing. And so as Jen mentioned, really you have 23andMe, and so people use the service, they sequence your genome and then they send it back to you. But the thing is, they also keep your genome data, and once they have the genome data, they'll just sell it to really anyone who asks, to be honest. It can get really scary if you think about it, because that could be used to help you, or it could be used to hurt you, because that could be sold to an insurance company to intentionally, well, not necessarily intentionally, but the insurance company could use that information to possibly raise your rates, or to enact a policy which might harm people like you that have certain health profiles. So that's something to keep in mind. Additionally, could also be bought by the governments or security agencies to help with their investigations. But of course, you might not necessarily want your genomic data to be used in such a way. So that's really the big thing with your opt-in versus opt-out. Is with 23andMe, it's more of a opt-out kind of scenario, where you have to try to get your data away from 23andMe. While with new data sources and with more data cooperatives, really the goal is to have more of an opt-in where I can choose to share my data, but I can pretty much take it out. So anytime instead of me sharing my data and then I have to go try to get it back, so it's more, oh, I share my data, I choose to share it instead of having it shared usually without my consent and having no control over the conditions under which it's shared or used. So that's really the big point there. And then moving on to patient equity. And as Jen mentions that patients should earn equity for pursuing trials for drug development. But once again, wants patients to share the upside of developing new drugs, and this could incentivize more people to share their data. But also, really the most important part that I think Jen really focuses on is really that contribution. It's like, oh, if I contribute, I should get rewarded. And it's like, oh, okay, I've participated in the trial, the drug is developed. Okay, I should get a little bit of the upside from that drug when it hits the market, rather than necessarily just, okay, get access to the drug. So yeah, a little bit more there. But I think Jen has a pretty good point, in that regard. And once again, Jen mentions really the beauty of co-ops is collective bargaining, and really goes to regain control. Once you have that collective bargaining ability, this goes back to the whole labor union or data union that gets mentioned in the principles for revenue models. Is that the goal is really to improve your bargaining power at a collective level, because it's really not something you can do individually. And I think so you can control your ability to bargain collectively, you should be able to regain somewhat control over how your data gets shared and used. So those are some really good points from this episode. Yeah, hopefully you guys really enjoyed this. I think it's a really good talk of trying to run a platform cooperative, especially a startup, which is a data marketplace, but also technically a gig marketplace. All right, moving on to the last slide. How data co-ops protect at the edge with Thorsten Dittmar, founder of Poly. That's a really good episode. And one of the really important parts that gets mentioned is that is privacy a luxury good? And this one that Thorsten talks about is that technically you could say it's one. Disregarding how data gets commodified. There might be a perverse incentive to have people share their data, and if there's a perverse incentive for people to share their data, generally if there's a need to share their data, it might be people are trying to make ends meet or to generate some revenue to keep themselves afloat, and so for them privacy might not really be data privacy might not be really an option. So if you have that commodification standpoint. Regarding data, might not necessarily resolve the privacy issues, because sure you'll have people having more control over where data gets shared, but if they're in a situation where they need to generate money from their data, then there's incentives to share the data anyway. So they're sharing the data because they truly want to share the data, or they're sharing that because they have to try to generate some revenue. So in that case, they don't necessarily have privacy. And to them, privacy becomes a luxury good, and that's something that Thorsten really wants to stop from happening with Poly. And I thought that was just a really good point to mention. Because there's some people who are privacy poor and some people who are privacy rich, and so that's something to also keep in mind if you're developing a data steward. It's how do you balance people who are privacy poor versus those who are privacy rich. And then Poly structure. So you have 3 organizations in this ecosystem. You have the Poly Foundation, which is kind of a franchiser trying to develop, data co-ops in other countries. You have the co-op, which is actually owned by the members. That's the one which owns the Polypod, the personal data store, and also the site for the edge computing. And then you have the enterprise, which is for businesses. So this to encourage businesses to use the data they get from the Polypod for the users in the co-op and to meet business needs. And some also really good points, regarding trust. Trust in real versus digital world. So as Thorsten mentioned, it's like, how do you build trust in the real world? Well, you do it through multiple interactions. While in the digital world, it's just like, oh, I'm a friend of this person. Oh, okay, like I'm a friend or follow this person on social network. It's like, we're not I don't necessarily trust that person. I just follow them or I'm friends with them, but that's not necessarily trust. It's like, just the very act of following or having that social relationship in this world. It's not necessarily the trust you would develop in the real world, but in the real world you have to get to know people. A really good point about sharing more information with people, personal information. Like I share personal information with someone, and then they share personal information with me. So this way, if I share their information, they share mine, and we're both kind of like mutually destroyed. So there's a good reason for us not to share private details. And you don't necessarily get that in the digital world. So I thought that was just a really good point to make, and so that goes back to their point that Thurston makes, regarding trust patterns, and you can show who you actually trust, and create a web of trust. And so this way, which that reflects more of how trust works in the real world rather than how it works in the digital world, where it's like, oh, I just have a certificate saying that I am X or Y or Z, and therefore, I just do X, Y, or Z. And it's like, well, yeah, no, it doesn't really work that way in the real world. So it's a really good discussion there about trust in the real world versus the digital world. And then move on to citizen-driven infrastructure. So one of the things Thorsten wants to do with Polyply is make sure that it's neutral to all companies who want data. So they're not going to kick anyone out, but they will have a list of like, of offenders who might have might have bad data sharing practices, but they're not gonna necessarily stop them from uh, asking for data from users who are part of the Polyply co-op from polypods or to use some of the computational resources. It's up to people to decide who they want to actually trust and who to share the data with, which is more empower the individual to decide how their data gets shared. And so this really shows how Polyply wants to empower the individual, but at the same time really allow for that collective governance and bargaining. So this way companies can't just kind of bully the individual polypod owner to gotta follow along the policies and the web of trust set by the individual, and Polyply just make sure that everything gets somewhat followed. Additionally, you have open source code, and then since it's citizen driven, it appears that the citizens are the ones who own Polyply rather than necessarily the government or it's a completely private organization. And then Polyply offers the infrastructure, and the users of the co-op use the infrastructure to do other things. So you can just use this your infrastructure, and you can use it to do the things you would like to do. So depending on what that is, you can use the edge computer resources to run algorithms. Try to get data to help improve recommender system. It's really up to you how you want to use it. So I thought that's a really important part to mention because they're looking more of somewhere like the public goods or more of a data commons or trying to do something that's for the common good. So that's really important. That's that the infrastructure has to be somewhat neutral if you want to be a public good. So if that's how you want to develop a data steward, that's something to look into. And then enhancing privacy and data quality, through the polypod. As Thorsten mentions repeatedly throughout the episode, the goal is not to stop data sharing. The goal is to actually have more data sharing and to increase the quality of data. Increase the quality of data, and by giving people more control over their how their data is stored and shared, they'll actually be more willing to share their data. And the data that you can provide, that they hope to provide, is going to be higher in quality. So it's not necessarily they need to collect big data, because you don't need a lot of data. What you usually do need is high quality data. The better quality of data, technically the less that you're going to need. So that's a really important part to mention. And then one of the ways they want to keep it private, but at the same time improve the quality is through federated learning. So instead of, of course, send data to the algorithm, they send the algorithm to the data, and then once you get the results, they send back the results. You don't actually get to see the actual raw data itself. You get just the results or some stats of the data. So this way, people's data is not necessarily going to be actually shared. And so that's why you can keep it private without. You keep it private and still encourage data sharing. And if you're doing fair learning, this way you can learn from multiple data sets at the same time. So this way you don't necessarily, once again, you don't need to look at a specific individual's data. You can just run the algorithm on multiple data sets, get the results back, and then you can make a judgment from there. But you don't ever need to send the data set to the algorithm. The algorithm comes to the data. So this way you can still keep it private. And so that's it for this lecture, for lecture 4. If you have any questions, comments, or other feedback, please send a message to lectureback at lectureback@gmail.com. You can also send a DM to @lectureback on Twitter, or you can post a message on the Lectureback forum under the Introduction to Data Cooperatives thread. Once again, I'm Charles Ojobu. I'm with Lectureback, and I'm the instructor for this course. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and you found the slides to be informative. And hopefully you found the readings to be informative and somewhat fun to read and listen to.